Hey guys, welcome back to Free Speech, the Natural United podcast, where we talk about issues that affect the world and beyond. And today we have a super interesting one in the area of energy, and that is nuclear power. And there's a lot of different ideas that surround this process of electrifying our society and figuring out a way to sustain the amount of people that we have on Earth. But it's actually something that I feel like is mischaracterized, and it's certainly not the form of energy that we're going to be using thousands of years from now, but I think it is an option that should be considered in more depth than it has been. So, just as a strict definition, nuclear power is the use of nuclear reactions that release nuclear energy to generate heat, which most frequently is then used in steam turbines to produce electricity in a nuclear power plant. Nuclear power can be obtained from nuclear fission, nuclear decay, and nuclear fusion reactions. And so most of the electricity that we're gaining from nuclear power is nuclear fission of uranium and plutonium. And something that's super important to know before I get into this video is that 10% of the electricity generation that we have all around the world is nuclear, derived from 443 different fission reactors, which adds up to about 395 gigawatts of power. So right now there are 56 nuclear reactors that are under construction, and there's also plans to create 120, most of which are located in Asia. But just to understand what we have going right now, which is 395 gigawatts in more depth, 1 gigawatt is 1 billion watts. So you can imagine just how powerful one of these reactors can turn out to be. And this really got going in the 1970s. That's when widespread development of nuclear power began. And since that time, we've basically been able to prevent 1.84 million deaths, along with 64 billion tons of carbon dioxide being released into the environment when we compare what would have happened to the world had we got that 10% of our global energy production from fossil fuels. So nuclear is much cleaner than fossil fuels, though in comparison, as I said, I'm sure thousands of years from now we'll figure out something that's far more efficient. But when compared to fossil fuels, it is much more sustainable. It's something that we could do for a lot longer than we could continue the process of fossil fuel production and manufacturing. So there are three counterexamples that are often quickly brought up, and I think for good reason, because we kind of have to learn from these events. It is definitely the negative side of nuclear power, and I couldn't make a video on it without bringing these three events up. Most recently, you have Fukushima, that was 2011 in Japan, and then you have Chernobyl, 1989 in Russia, and then beyond that, 3 Mile Island in the late 70s in 1979. And these three events are a testament to the dangers of nuclear power and the different things that we need to do to ensure that they don't happen in the future. Fukushima happened as a result of where it was located, and then Chernobyl as a result of not having the proper protocol to make sure that everything's being monitored, and then 3 Mile Island. And so you have three different examples of different situations where it makes people think, I don't think that we should utilize the benefits of nuclear power simply because the consequences can be so dire. And while I definitely agree we need to continue to make sure that every single thing that we do with uranium is completely closely monitored, videotaped, and we hopefully will have computers overlooking every single thing that we do in each of the reactors. But at the same time, it's also important to note that there are many, many situations with fossil fuels that are much more damaging. Now, I know the area of Chernobyl is still off limits, and that's an example of the archaic nuclear power that we were using 30 years ago. But at the end of the day, when we compare the net negative effects of nuclear power to the net negative effects of fossil fuels, it is very apparent that the damage that we are creating as a result of fossil fuels is much more superior. And so I definitely do not want to justify the idea that nuclear power is the end-all be-all, the thing that we'll use to power the entire world. But I also think that it is an important alternative to consider going forward into the future. So if you rewind to the year 1932, America is about to start the Great Depression, and it's nearly 100 years ago, so the makeup of the country is almost entirely different. Just over 100 million people lived in America at that time, and a man named Ernest Rutherford basically discovered that splitting lithium atoms by protons from a proton accelerator caused immense energy to be released, and this is kind of when people refer to the mass energy equivalence, that's what they're talking about. And so that was a super important discovery because it forged the way for us to figure out a method where we can power 10% of our world and probably more going into the future. So the first man-made reactor, which was known as Chicago Pile 1, was created in 1942 with the intention of furthering the Manhattan Project. So actually a lot of the developments that we've made in nuclear power have come as a result of trying to make weapons, which of course is not the ideal scenario, but at the end of the day, those initiatives have been able to help us figure out how we can provide electricity to countless people around the world. And so as a result of that, the United Nations created the World Association of Nuclear Operations, also known as WANO. And this was created after Chernobyl to promote safety, awareness, and professional development of nuclear operators. And so after all of these events, Austria, Sweden, and Italy, they all were very, very troubled by what had happened. They said, we're going to cut back entirely on our nuclear power. We're going to cut back greatly on our nuclear power because we don't want something like that to happen in our own country. So there are places around the world that say the risks really aren't worth what we can get out of it. And I think to that I would say, in a certain aspect, they're right in the sense that there is definitely a way to generate power where the negative consequences are not going to be nearly as grave as if something bad happens nuclear. But when, like I said, when we compare it to fossil fuels, it's a very, very different outcome. So there's kind of 5 factors that go into nuclear energy that I think are super important to consider in terms of the beginning to end process of how we get nuclear energy. So we start with uranium mining, and the Macarthur River uranium mine is also known for collecting 13% of the global uranium production. This is in Canada. So there are these concentrated areas that are the production hubs for the vast majority of materials related to nuclear energy. And then beyond that, the ore is then converted to yellowcake, which has the chemicals U3O8, and that makes it easier to transport from one place to the next. And then they enrich the uranium to 3 to 5%, making uranium-235. The following step is then using fuel rods for 6 years inside the reactor, and then after 5 years in a fuel pool, those nuclear reactors that were working constantly for 6 years are then radioactively and thermally cooled enough to be able to handle and put them somewhere. And now obviously that's not zero consequence for the environment, but when you compare the amount of power that you get out of one of those rods to the amount of fuel that it would take with fossil fuels to get that much power, it's a very, very, very different story. So there 430 different locations around the world where these are being deposited. And so when we look at nuclear power, I think it's very clear that it could help us bridge the gap between using non-renewable energy to renewable energy. I think that because it's such a powerful way to collect electricity and power the world, it might be more efficient to invest more in nuclear resources until the point we can invest in green energy and make that our system around the entire world. So time will tell whether or not the proliferation of nuclear power will come, but when you ask most people in the energy world, it is probably the most efficient means that we have at our disposal right now, but hopefully years down the road we figure out something that has not only zero environmental impact, but can power the world much quicker and with less energy required. So thank you guys. And I think this is an important idea to express because nuclear does have a bad reputation, but when we compare it to fossil fuels, the numbers really don't add up in favor for fossil fuels, so I thought that was worth saying in a video. But beyond that, if there is a topic relating to the environment or space or society that you want us to cover in future episodes, leave it in the comments. We're on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, we're starting TikTok, and then we're also on YouTube and LinkedIn. So feel free to reach out, and we will see you with a very interesting episode next.